In a grim fortress on the coast of Europe, an anonymous prisoner sits in a cell, his thoughts consumed with vengeance. A one-time nobleman who commanded armies, he's now been forgotten by the world, his name scratched from history. Betrayed by those closest to him, the man's only hope is to somehow escape and visit retribution on his enemies. Sound familiar? Well, if you're a fan of literature, you're probably now thinking of Edmond Dante, the wrongly imprisoned hero of 19th century French adventure masterpiece, The Count of Monte Cristo. But while everything in that opening paragraph could apply to Alexandre Dumas' famous character, we weren't talking about anyone fictional. No, everything in that swashbuckling opening really happened to a real man. His name was Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, and his adventures would inspire his son's greatest novel. A former count who served in France's Revolutionary Wars, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas was a one-man army. He fought alongside Napoleon, single-handedly defeating scores of enemies, and he was worshipped as a hero. And he did all of this while being proudly, defiantly black. Betrayed in his lifetime, ignored by history, this is the epic tale of General Dumas, the real Count of Monte Cristo. When he came to write his swashbuckling epics like the Three Musketeers, the great French author Alexandre Dumas wouldn't have to look very far for inspiration. As a boy, he'd spent hours on his mother's lap, transfixed by her tales of a daring soldier, a romantic hero as brave and chivalrous as he was strong. But these hadn't been regular bedtime stories, the sorts of tales we might read our own children. They'd all been true. The stories Dumas heard had been about his father, who died when the boy was only 3. Those tales were far stranger and far more exciting than anything Dumas would ever write. The story of Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, or Alex as he preferred to be known, began not in France, but thousands of kilometers away in Saint-Domingue, which we today call Haiti. And it begins not with his birth, but with the meeting of two very unlikely people. Alexandre-Antoine Davy de la Pailleterie was an immoral aristocrat looking to make a quick buck in the colonies while waiting to inherit his family's title. Since Saint-Domingue in the 18th century was the richest colony in the richest empire, he'd come to the right place. His brother was already a successful plantation owner. But Antoine himself would prove way too lazy and way too much of an asshole to get into the sugar game. Stealing a bunch of his brother's slaves, he instead vanished off into the mountains to live a life of leisure. Since this was a time and place where a white guy's leisure usually meant exploiting black people, it wasn't long before Antoine decided to buy himself a lover. Today there's very little we know about Marie-Céssette Dumas. Even her name is uncertain. Some sources give Louise instead of Marie, while the meaning of her surname, Dumas, has been a source of constant speculation. Some think it means of the farm, implying she was a free woman managing a sugar plantation. On the other hand, the name may have indicated she was owned by an estate and that Antoine bought her when she was still enslaved. It was from this union between a louche white aristocrat and an exploited black woman that Thomas-Alexandre Dumas was born. From the moment he first opened his eyes, the boy was plunged into a legal grey area. Saint-Domingue in 1762 was a place obsessed with racial hierarchies, with whites firmly at the top and black folk firmly at the bottom. Unlike America's slave system, though, Saint-Domingue's pyramid of exploitation had a whole middle category, those of mixed race. It was in this category that young Alex Dumas found himself. Although dark-skinned, Alex was nearly as free as any white in the colony. The local coloureds, as they were called, were seen as completely distinct from the enslaved blacks and frequently held positions of power. This meant that Alex spent his first 12 years with a freedom his mother could only dream of, able to wander the back roads near his father's estate, treated almost like any white man. But almost isn't the same as exactly, and Alex was about to find out, in the worst way possible, how Saint-Domingue exploited people like him. In 1775, Antoine got the news that his relatives back in France had died, and the title of Marquis was now his for the taking. The only trouble was, he couldn't afford the boat fare, and his brother was still too pissed at him to lend him the money. So Antoine did something utterly unthinkable, something so immoral, we can't believe we're actually saying it. He sold his own son to slavery. It is impossible today to know how Thomas-Alexandre felt as his father handed him over, took the money, and then vanished off to France. Aged only 12, this strapping young boy was now somebody else's property. In Saint-Domingue, this could only be a death sentence. The violence meted out to slaves in the colony was sadistic even by the standards of the time. While France's Black Code was meant to protect the enslaved, the reality was one of whippings, beatings, mutilation, and an extremely early death. Thankfully, it's a system Alex would only exist in for a short period of time. In late 1776, with his title and inheritance secured, Antoine suddenly sent for his enslaved son. Aged 14, Alex was put on board a ship to France. The moment he left Saint-Domingue, he also left behind his life as a slave. Metropolitan, or mainland, France had never allowed slavery, and by simply travelling there, Alex automatically became free. But it wasn't life as a freeman that was awaiting him in Europe. It was the life of a gentleman. So here's the weird thing about Antoine. Despite being content to literally sell his own son, he was also determined to make sure that the same son grew up to be everything he wanted in an heir. Antoine showered the boy with expensive clothing, gave him lessons in everything from philosophy to dueling and horse riding. It must have been head-spinning for a teenage boy used to life on a small estate in the Caribbean, especially when he moved with Antoine to Paris, then the greatest city on earth. It was in the French capital that Alex grew to a 6'2" muscular hunk, the sort of guy society girls fawned over, and fawn they did. At this time, having dark skin in Paris wasn't always a disadvantage. Wealthy, mixed-race gens de la couleur libre from the colonies made up a small but vital part of the social scene. Alex Dumas slipped into this world like a hand into a perfumed glove. He was visible at the theatre, at fancy salons and ballroom dances, living a life of glorious success. This was the era of Marie-Antoinette, remember? France, for the aristocracy, was a whirlwind of glittering parties the starving masses in the street could only dream of. Yet while Antoine's wealth allowed Alex to live like any other society aristocrat, society also never let him forget that he was different. In September of 1784, for example, Alex was at a play when a young white man began hurling racial abuse. When Alex tried to fight back, the young man's cronies beat him and forced him to kneel before their leader. Although the police intervened, the young white man got off scot-free. It must have been infuriating for Thomas-Alexandre, as if he was living in a twilight world, half in a place of privilege and power and half in a place of racism and oppression. Perhaps this feeling of both belonging and not belonging explains what happened next. In 1786, aged 26, Alex suddenly announced that he was done with his life of leisure and wanted to enroll in the army. At first, Antoine refused. Then he agreed, but only if Alex never used the family name again. So Alex enlisted in the Queen's Dragoons, and when it came time to give his second name, he didn't use his father's, but his mother's. He would now be Thomas-Alexandre Dumas until the day he died. Despite his noble background, Alex didn't join the Dragoons as an officer. He started at the bottom, assigned to some backward-ass town at the lowest rank, where he divided his time between getting into fights and chasing local girls. There, he earned a reputation as a loudmouth with a volatile temper, but also a gifted fighter who was harder than anyone. In a single day, he once fought 3 duels. Talented and tough as he was, though, it would be events that made Alex Dumas famous. Specifically, one of the biggest events in Western history. On July the 14th, 1789, an angry mob stormed the Bastille, Paris, in prison, turning all that free-floating rage at France's unequal society into social upheaval. It was the kickoff of the French Revolution, a time of dizzying violence and world-changing ideas, the biggest of which would land just 1 month later. On August the 26th, 1789, the Revolution's new National Assembly issued its first great document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Article 1. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, no matter what the color of their skin. Just like that, a shining new era of racial equality was born. Well, that was the idea at least. We'll get to why things didn't quite work out a little bit later. For now, just know this document struck a chord deep within Alex Dumas. Despite his father's aristocratic backgrounds, from that moment on, Alex was a die-hard supporter of the revolution. He would fight for its ideals, no matter what. Yet, while metropolitan France really did seem committed to this whole liberty, equality, fraternity thing, the same couldn't be said of the colonies. Back in Saint-Domingue, the right resistance to the Declaration would snowball into a slave uprising that sparked a hideous war. For Alex, though, his heart was no longer in the Caribbean, but it was here, in Europe. When the National Assembly, under the sway of the radical Girondists, declared war on France's neighbours in April 1792, Dumas was only too willing to fight for them. It was the opening of the French Revolutionary Wars, a near decade of upheaval that would bring Europe to its knees. It would also be the making of Thomas-Alexandre Dumas. Remember how Alex loved fighting duels? Well, for him, the war became a chance to do something he loved all day, every day. The same spring war broke out, he made a name for himself by capturing a group of 12 Austrian soldiers without firing a single shot. Barely had his officers had time to finish saying, "Damn, that was good," then Alex had burnished his credentials further by leading a mere 4 horsemen to attack an Austrian garrison. There were 50 Austrian soldiers against them, but Dumas' horsemen of the apocalypse they won easily. From that moment on, it seemed like nothing could stop the young man's rise. Along with his fighting skills and strength, Alex had the good fortune to be a committed revolutionary at a time when non-radical officers were fleeing the army or getting purged. In this new equal era, what was to stop him from reaching the very top? It was during those first years of the war that legends began to collect around Thomas-Alexandre Dumas. On the absurd end, there was the rumor that he was so strong he could get on his horse, reach up and grab a beam of wood and start doing pull-ups that lifted the horse off the ground. That's right, Alex Dumas was basically a Chuck Norris meme before Chuck Norris was even a thing. On the still absurd but also true end, there was the tale of how he met his wife. In the first months of the war, as chaos was gripping rural France, a band of brigands attacked Villers-Cotterêts. They were threatening a bourgeois local girl, Marie-Louise Labouret, when the dashingly handsome Dumas came charging into town like a one-man Three Musketeers and saved her life. After the two fell in love, Alex asked Labouret's father for permission to marry her. Since he was still a lowly pirate, Pop Labouret told him to come back when he got his officer's commission and became a sergeant. Dumas rode away and he'd come back shortly after having been promoted 4 ranks above sergeant. Monsieur Labouret wisely allowed the marriage to proceed. As the months passed, the revolution's promise of racial equality began to pick up steam. As an officer, Alex was second in command to the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, then famous classical composer, who likewise had been born to a rich white dad and an enslaved mother. Their Légion Noire was the first all-black fighting unit in Europe, an elite regiment of swordsmen prepared to die for the revolution. Mostly, though, it was their enemies who did the dying. In yet another insane but true tale, Alex once tried to lead his men up a sheer wall of ice in the middle of the night to surprise an Austrian battery. At the top, they turned the Austrians' own guns on them, leading to around 1,700 men immediately surrendering. With badassery like that, it's perhaps no surprise the National Assembly approached Alex about going to Saint-Domingue to end the slave rebellion. But Alex seemingly had no interest in his old home, or maybe he just didn't want to join that inferno on what could clearly be the wrong side. Instead, he stayed in France. In August 1793, they made him general. Aged just 31, Dumas was now the highest-ranking black European soldier this side of the Roman Empire. And still, his star kept rising. Late 1793 was spent leading 53,000 men in the Alps, terrifying the Austrians so badly that he earned himself the nickname the Black Devil. But this was just propaganda with some good old-fashioned racism thrown in. While he was a powerful fighter, especially in close quarters, General Dumas was no devil. Whereas plenty of other Revolutionary-era generals rolled out the guillotine whenever they entered a new village, Alex had his guillotine burned for firewood. Whereas other generals ordered summary executions for anyone slightly to the right of Robespierre, Alex issued pardons to civilians for political crimes. It was an attitude that earned him the mocking nickname Mr. Humanity. It also nearly earned him an early grave. In 1794, Dumas was sent to fight in the Vendée, a heavily Catholic region of France that had gone into rebellion against secular Paris. The revolution had now gone fully off the rails. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had been guillotined, Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety were in charge, and the reign of terror was in absolute full swing. In the Vendée, something called the Infernal Columns were marching across the landscape, slaughtering anyone who stood in their way. As a general in the region, Alex was supposed to follow suit. Instead, he forbid his men from plundering and refused to slaughter civilians. In the Reign of Terror, such leniency was enough to get you killed. Denounced, Dumas was stripped of his command and sent to Paris to face justice. From being the poster boy of the revolution, had suddenly fallen to one of its bitterest enemies. In 1794, this could only mean one thing. Thomas-Alexandre Dumas was certain for a date with the guillotine. In the end, it was sheer dumb luck that saved General Dumas. While he was languishing in jail awaiting execution, the National Convention finally turned on Robespierre. On July the 27th, 1794, or 9 Thermidor Year 2 in the revolutionary calendar, the tyrant was denounced and overthrown. Rather than Dumas, it was Robespierre who went to the guillotine as his severed head dropped into the basket. The era of Jacobin terror reached its bloody end. In the wake of the Thermidorian reaction, political prisoners like Dumas were released. By now, slavery had been banned across the entire empire, Black folk had full citizenship, the right to vote, the right to study alongside their white peers. Over in Saint-Domingue, the French were even reluctantly recognizing the former slave Toussaint L'Ouverture as their official representative in the colony. But even with these great strides, Dumas seems to have had enough. In 1795, he declared that he wanted out, that he wanted to quit the army and go back to normal life. By now, France was under the rule of the corrupt reactionary Directory. While less into removing heads than Robespierre had been, they still weren't the kind of guys he said no to, so when they told Alex his resignation was unacceptable, that was that. The only change they'd allow was to transfer Dumas away from the Alps, where he kept quarreling with his superiors, to the Italian front. They'd fight under a promising young general from Corsica, a young man extremely into bicorn hats and conquest. On paper, Alexandre Dumas and Napoleon Bonaparte, they should have been BFFs. They were both talented in the field, both ambitious, both part of a new generation brought to prominence by the revolution. Heck, Bonnie's wife Joséphine even hailed from Martinique, a colony in Dumas' old backyard. In real life, though, things would quickly sour. Although Napoleon initially hailed Dumas' bravery for doing bonkers things like single-handedly securing a bridge in the face of an entire cavalry squadron, the two men quickly began to show signs of rivalry. That might have been fine if they'd gone their separate ways when the war ended in October 1797, but the Directory had other plans. Rather than leave two popular generals standing bored until they decided to remove them from power, the Directory encouraged them both to go on an expedition to Egypt. Today, Napoleon's 1798 Egypt expedition is famous for its scientific and archaeological advances. It should also be famous for being an utter disaster. At first, General Dumas was able to pull off some astounding cavalry victories, but it pretty soon became clear that the French were in an untenable position. Soon after landing, the British under Nelson had destroyed all their ships and blockaded the port. Now they were stuck in Egypt as enemy armies marched overland towards them, unable to get reinforcements or do anything but watch as the expedition spiraled out of control. Under this insane pressure, the relationship between Dumas and Napoleon completely broke down. Dumas publicly accused Napoleon of wasting resources and betraying the revolution's goals, and strongly hinted that he should be one leading the army. Napoleon, for his part, was outraged when he discovered the locals thought the tall, powerful Dumas was the expedition's leader, while he was merely a servant. But the real blowout came after an informant told Napoleon that Dumas and other generals might be plotting mutiny. In the tense meeting that followed, it was decided that General Dumas should return to France right away. On March 7, 1799, Alex boarded a boat, fully intending to return to the Republic, to return to his wife, to return to his glittering military career. Sadly, he'd never make it. As the ship cast off that fateful day, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas and Napoleon Bonaparte were still nearly equals, two powerful rivals who were popular heroes. Before the year had ended, that would have all changed. One of them would have seized power and become the first consul of France, while the other would be betrayed, forgotten, and left to rot in a dungeon far from home. So here we are at last, the moment when Alex Dumas will be betrayed and locked away like the Count of Monte Cristo. Unlike his fictional counterpart, though, Alex would never get to take his revenge. The problems began on the voyage home. The boat soon turned out to be unseaworthy and was forced to pull into port for repairs. Unfortunately, that port was in an Italian kingdom that was very much against the whole chopping off the heads of kings thing that France was currently into. As soon as the ship docked, Alex and the other Frenchmen on board were taken as prisoners of war. Locked up in a Naples dungeon, Dumas waited for the Directory to bargain for his release, to pay whatever it took to secure the release of one of their best generals. But the days of the Directory were already over. On November 9, 1799, also known as 18 Brumaire, year 8, Napoleon Bonaparte returned to Paris, overthrew the government, and made himself ruler of France. And, well, you could probably guess how eager the new first consul was to secure his old rival's release. In the end, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas languished in prison for 20 months. During that time, the conditions of his squalid cell physically broke him. His jailers slipped him poison, not enough to kill him, but enough to leave him partially paralyzed and blind in one eye. When he was finally released in late 1801, it was only due to a sustained campaign by his wife. By that time, the damage had already been done, not just to General Dumas, but also to the revolution. Despite coming up in the same era of equality as Alex, Napoleon had no need for racial justice. Not long after Dumas' release, the first consul issued a law reinstating slavery in France's colonies. He sent an expedition to attack Saint-Domingue and restore white rule. While it would ultimately fail, it would destroy one of the other great black generals of the revolution, Toussaint L'Ouverture, who would die in a French prison. In France itself, interracial marriages were banned, equality was binned, and the clock turned back to a grim era the revolutionaries assumed that they'd left behind. It was in this miserable new system that Alex would spend the last years of his life. Although the ex-general was entitled to it, Napoleon refused to pay his pension and forbid anyone from mentioning his old rival's name. Broken, beaten down and penniless, Alex and Marie-Louise moved back to Villers-Cotterêts. There, on February the 26th, 1806, aged only 43, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas died of stomach cancer. At the moment of his death, General Dumas was leaving behind a world in which he no longer had any part. In 1804, Napoleon had been coronated emperor, crushing the last of the revolution's ideals under the jackboot of tyranny. A few months before that, Dumas' old home of Saint-Domingue had ceased to exist, declaring independence as the country of Haiti, the first free black republic in history. The declaration had been accompanied by all French citizens being killed or expelled. A famous French general like Dumas could have never gone back. Perhaps the saddest thing, though, was the birth of his son, Alexandre Dumas. When the boy was born in July of 1802, his mother had been overcome with relief to see that he looked white. After all, she only had to glance at her broken, rejected husband to see how France treated its black men. In the wake of his death, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas would be written out of history. Despite being one of the iconic generals of his era, only a single statue was ever made of him. No one would write books about his exploits until the modern age. Well, almost no one. When General Dumas' son finally grew up and became a novelist, it would be to the memory of his long-dead father that he turned for inspiration. In tales like the Three Musketeers, and especially the Count of Monte Cristo, the spirit of Alex would be channeled into tough, romantic heroes, brave men who fought honorably even when their enemies didn't. Brave men whose lives had far happier endings than their real-life counterpart. It may not have been how he wished to be remembered, but in a sense, these stories would give General Dumas a sort of immortality, a way for the world to always remember this brave, remarkable man. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.